Welcome to How the World Works. I'm Kevin Williamson. This podcast is brought to you by CEI. This is a podcast where we talk about work and the jobs we've had and the role of work in our lives and the broader social meaning of work. Today I have with me, not a relation of Charles Barkley, is Rachel Barkley, no relation. And she is with Able America. And why don't we start by talking about the events in your life that led to your having this focus on disability?
Sure, yeah. It's something that I never thought about. I was in my 20s, really an athletic kind of go-getter type. I worked on Capitol Hill and I worked for think tanks and had kind of progressed in my career, got married. My husband and I bought a house on Capitol Hill, and 3 years after we got married, got pregnant with our first child. And everything was going kind of according to plan. Our lives were pretty easy.
You were those insufferable Washington people. I
We
get it.
were. We were exactly that.
Yeah.
We went on fun trips all the time. I was one of those people that, ran down the mall and odd hours of the night and was always doing something kind of athletic. And Actually, my due date was 2 days after I turned 30, and I'm getting ready to have this baby, and perfectly healthy delivery, brought him home, and I started getting weaker and weaker and weaker. And two weeks after I had him, I woke up mysteriously paralyzed after this kind of weeks of weakness and kind of off balance in my pregnancy, but everyone said that was normal for a pregnant woman to be off balance. And I go to the emergency room, get scanned from head to toe to see what is going on. Why did I wake up like this? And it turns out I had an incredibly rare tumor growing in my spinal cord. And this tumor had grown to the level that it paralyzed me. And a week after they found this, I went to Johns Hopkins for the best surgeon in the country to deal with this really rare tumor. And he removed the entire tumor from my spine, but I woke up from that surgery paralyzed from the shoulders down. And so we're talking, I wasn't even able to sit myself up in bed, and here I was with a newborn. I'd had a career in public policy before with really a large focus on the social safety net and the most vulnerable. And so I was familiar with head knowledge on kind of what our social safety net looks like in this country, but I had not experienced it before. And so I went on this journey of 3 months in a rehabilitation hospital where they were teaching me how to live in a wheelchair and what it was like to be a quadriplegic, as well as intense physical therapy to get back what I could. And I've been in that physical therapy now for the 6 years that I've been paralyzed. And but throughout that, I had to make different choices of, what government assistance would I want to be on, or would I want to keep working, and what kind of supports would I need in the workplace and personally? What does it look like to be married and to go on vacation and, all of these different parts of living that you really take for granted before you lose the ability to walk and move and have different chronic illness kind of comorbidities.
Yeah. So you're no longer quadriplegic then?
Well, I technically still am. So
Are
the
you technically?
definition of
Okay.
quadriplegia is if any of your 3 out of 4 limbs are affected. So I've got
I
a
see.
numb hand and diminished ability to walk, but I can now walk a bit.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
How did that come about?
It came about with 6 hard years of work and prayer. So I do really think it's miraculous. They didn't know what would come back when I was lying in that hospital bed I was, this vivid feelings. It's the weirdest feeling in the world to wake up and ask your leg to move and your leg won't move.
Yeah.
And not have any control, and willing my pinky toe to move and, each progressive muscle in my body.
Now, you knew going into the surgery this was a possible or likely outcome, I assume.
The first doctor who came in with that shocking scan of what was in my body said, "You're a young family. You want to get your affairs in order," like to the point of this surgery you might not wake up from.
Yeah.
And then he told us that there's a good likelihood that I would be a quadriplegic.
Yeah. That has got to be just emotionally and psychologically a very, I mean, hard to say nothing, but strange place to be in because you're being pulled simultaneously in lots of different directions. You've got this newborn who normally is the number one focus of a new parent's life.
Yeah.
But then you've got this enormous personal health issue going on. But it's not just personal because it's going to affect, what kind of mother you can be and how you provide for your young family and all that. So just take me through those first couple of days after the surgery.
Oof, yeah. The first couple of days, the first weeks were honestly just fighting for my life.
Yeah.
So there's this progression of survival, and then how do you live after surviving something, right? And so survival was just, I'd had a couple days after surgery, I had a pulmonary embolism where I did basically, if the nurse's hands weren't on me, I would have been dead. But praise God, the nurses were all around me when it happened and resuscitated me. But after that, it really was just this will to get up every day of like, I have to learn how to sit up. I have to learn how to sit myself up. I have to learn how to put socks on. I have to learn how to get into a wheelchair. Like I don't have a choice because I have a child, because I have a husband, all of these things. I can't stay like this. I have to learn how to live in this body, no matter what level of healing I get. And so it's incredibly dark of, here I am supposed to be a mother and I can't even bathe myself. So it was an incredibly dark place.
How'd your husband do?
It was.
Well, you should probably point out he used to work here at the Competitive Enterprise Institute.
Yes. Yep. He is an alum here. He loved it here. He's an incredible person. He has always been just a steady rock of a personality. Like not much ruffles him. But yeah, he would say definitely the darkest thing he's ever experienced is not knowing whether I'd wake up or not. And we would both say we were incredibly grateful for the community around us. And I think that's something that we're missing in the society at large is people don't have the kind of social networks that we have. We definitely would not have come through like we did if we did not have tight family and friend circles who brought us meals for 6 months after this happened and covered the costs. So we raised the money to cover our medical costs, the cost of wheelchairs, the cost of ramps, renovating our house, all these things. We ended up raising over $100,000 to cover these first 6 months.
Yeah. I almost wish I had your husband here a little bit to ask him about this because there's kind of a cartoon version of the sort of libertarianism we practice around here at CEI that basically all problems can be solved with the maxim, well, the free market will take care of it eventually. But the free market doesn't take care of everything. Particularly in the realm of people with disabilities, there's a lot of human capital on the sidelines because people are unable to work for reasons unrelated to their ability to do productive work. And that is part of what you're working on, as I understand it. So why don't you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, exactly. This core kind of CEI belief and libertarian belief that all humans have this dignity and this drive to working and producing is an innate value and provides so much more to people. It's not limited to only people who don't have disabilities. And so especially you look at the population in America, so 60 million people have disabilities, and then 40 million people are caretakers. That's 100 million Americans who are affected by disabilities. And not addressing barriers to work and independence with that many people.
I can hear people out in the podcast audience right now insisting that those numbers are inflated, that in a country of 325 million people, there's no way a third of the people are
affected.
Yeah.
Well, but when you think about bringing in the caretakers and what, you've got children with different disabilities. This is intellectual, physical, and developmental. You think about the aging population. So maybe it is, but there's a lot of things people, like autism is counted in that. Older folks who have mobility challenges, you know. So when you think of, especially now, we have an aging population. I think a lot of people say those numbers are actually lower because reporting some people don't want to identify as having a
Or
disability.
they just think of it as normal because you're 86 and like being 86 sucks.
Yeah.
Like
you're going to be
in
using
great
a
shape,
walker.
it's going to be tough.
I always say to people, I'm like, it hit me early, but it's going to hit everyone. You're all going to become disabled.
Yeah. So, as you get hit by a truck or something. But
Yeah.
There's no good way out of that one. Anyway, I cut you off though. Please go ahead.
Yeah.
We're talking about the value of bringing disabled people into the workforce and helping them to live fuller economic lives.
And I think there are, beyond just the numbers that they do seem awfully large, beyond just the numbers of people who have disabilities, you also think about there are so many people who have temporary moments in their lives. So maybe it's not a permanent disability, but you're taking care of an aging parent or you have a baby. When you think about postpartum periods of time, it's almost like having a disability, right, of everything you're physically dealing with. And so the accommodations to help people and the social safety net to help people during this time ends up benefiting so many more people, I think, just having this mindset of how do we remove barriers to work? How do we accommodate people in workplaces?
So how do we remove barriers to work and accommodate people in workplaces?
It's a good question.
I've heard a number of sort of libertarian-leaning conservatives over the years say that when the Americans with Disabilities Act was being negotiated and debated back in the day, a lot of us felt it was too intrusive, too invasive, expensive, heavy-handed, and all that. And I think a lot of people have changed their minds about it since then. That in retrospect, it looks like these accommodations have actually been needful and maybe not strictly speaking on some kind of cost-benefit analysis that you could make an econometric case for, but certainly probably worth the investment and worth the disruption. And it's become just kind of a normal part of commercial life and commercial construction and that sort of thing. It's now baked into the cake in such a way that it doesn't seem as disruptive as people thought it would be. Is that your view, or what do you think?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's funny. I still see libertarians popping up saying the ADA didn't accomplish, people aren't working more, blah, blah, and I kind of like to remind libertarians that the ADA is a civil rights law, right? It's not an employment, incentive or whatnot, right? There aren't incentives to employment or the fixes to the social safety net that need to happen. It's just a civil rights law of basic access, of not being discriminated against in a workplace. That's a civil rights kind of equal playing field setter. And so I do think people have come to see that was necessary, right? Of having, we can all go into the same buildings and have a bathroom that works for us. And that seems obvious in hindsight. But you think about the cultural changes that having that law as a foundation has made. And you see now, for example, I think parents of children with Down syndrome, their kids are integrated into schools and integrated into life, and now are getting integrated into workplaces. And that is something that you wouldn't have imagined 40 years ago. But having that kind of equal playing field is now something like, oh, we can actually see this is possible.
Yeah. So what are the most effective policies in terms of getting people integrated into workplaces? What do you think are the least effective ones? Which aspects of the social safety net do you think work well? Which ones need reform? With a kind of work focus?
I think there's a lot there. But one thing I think COVID unmasked different work policies and their incentives and disincentives, and the flexibility and accommodations that were given to everybody during COVID to work remotely, to understand, at the time we thought people needed more protection or accommodation for illnesses or being vulnerable to catching COVID. And the disability community, the chatter in the disability community was, these accommodations that everybody gets to work remotely, we've been asking for this for decades. And we can get into the workplace if we can work remote sometimes when we have a flare-up or, a chronic pain day or whatnot. And we were never given those accommodations before. So that's less public policy. That's more culture. But COVID really showed, for example, I got back into the workplace after So I became disabled in 2019. COVID hits, and I decided I want to go back to work in about 2021. And I started a business completely remotely and ended up having 5, 6, 7 clients over the past years. And I really don't think before COVID would I have been able to start a business on Zoom and get 6, 7 clients. I don't know if I would have.
Yeah.
And so I think that kind of cultural accommodation and understanding changed with COVID. I hope it's not reverting back. I kind of see that it is a bit. And then I can get into policy as well, but that's the cultural piece, and then we can talk about the social safety net stuff as well.
Let's do that. I was just thinking, though, we were thinking about the ADA stuff. Whenever I visit a very old city, like cities that were built on, the kind of quaint, charming pedestrian scale that we all like.
Portland, Maine, or
or Paris,
Yeah.
or Delhi, places like that. Occasionally, it occurred to me that if you didn't walk well, it would be just unlivable.
yeah.
And so there are, I suppose, some trade-offs there. We've gotten used to the doorway issues and ramps and rails and things like that. And again, as I said earlier, it's just kind of become baked into the architectural cake in some ways. But then it sort of seems like once that was done, it was one of those issues that was treated about in a way that we solved that one now. We can stop thinking about it. But I don't think we quite got there in terms of the broader implementation of policies that will help us tap this human capital that's out there.
Yeah, and I mean, you're right. There's still a lot of work on physical accessibility. Before I became disabled, I didn't think about it, but
Why would you?
Yeah, we never crossed my mind. My husband and I went to a date night in Alexandria in Old Town, and we had dinner, and then we went to go get ice cream, and we're like, let's go to Ben & Jerry's, who claim human rights for all on every poster at Ben & Jerry's. No entrance for people with disabilities at all. I asked the workers inside, is there a way for my wife to get in through the back door, anything? And you have to have reasonable accommodation. No, there's no way for me to get in there. I cannot visit the Ben & Jerry's in Alexandria.
And that's because it's in an old part of town, so it's grandfathered in under some rule or something.
I'm not an ADA expert, but there still needs to be reasonable accommodations, like a ramp through the back kitchen entrance or something like that. So I don't know how they're getting away with that, but
Yeah. So how do we maximize people's opportunities to work?
Yeah. So, I think when we think about the American social safety net, most Americans would agree that we need a safety net for the most vulnerable. And the problem is, in our generosity to build this safety net, we have so circumscribed the parameters around the different programs people depend upon that people get trapped in them because there isn't a way out. And when I say trapped, it's because we have income and asset limits for all of their means-tested programs. And so if you are on Social Security disability, you cannot, if you're a single person, save more than $2,000 a year. And if you're a married couple, any more than $3,000 a year, or else you lose the program benefits. And what ends up happening is how do you build a ramp out of, I needed this, I got in a car accident, I became disabled, I couldn't work for a time, and so I depended upon this, but now how do I get hand controls in my car? How do I go into a workplace when I need accommodations for, different health issues that I might have? All of that is incredibly daunting to figure out. Will I find someone who will hire me and accommodate me for that? But at the same time, I need to afford living. And I need to keep that small, meager stipend from Social Security disability to do that. But if I save any money, then I lose that. So you have no financial security as you're transitioning back to work. And the programs that we have to build that bridge, there's a program called Ticket to Work that's supposed to help you do that. It's incredibly complicated, and the average person has to hire someone to help them understand, what are the rules of this? How much can I work before I lose it? And so the disincentives in the social safety net to work are incredibly high. And then when you look at Medicaid, so most people with disabilities who need a caretaker, whether it's in a nursing home setting or whether that is a personal care attendant in their own home who comes in and helps around the house, helps them bathe, etc. Private insurance does not cover that kind of care. It's just not available. When I became disabled, my private insurer told me you get 10 nurses visits a year. And that wasn't even a personal care attendant. That was someone who came and took my blood pressure. And I was on the congressional plan, right? So this is like one of the best plans. And you have to have Medicaid as your provider unless you're filthy rich.
Yeah.
And exceedingly, insanely rich, not just normal rich.
Private jet money we're talking about.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. It's, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year for this kind of service. And Medicaid for people with disabilities, if you qualify through your disability, you have these asset and income limits. Now, our expansion population on Medicaid, the non-disabled population, doesn't have those asset limits. We can talk about that disparity in the program. But for people with disabilities, they say, I can't lose my personal care assistant if I start working and make over this amount.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, and people who follow my work will know this is on my personal bingo card, but the problem with the social safety net, I'm not sure I even like that expression, but we all know what we're talking about, isn't that it costs too much money to take care of people who don't have their own resources. I mean, it's expensive, but it's a doable thing. It's a couple of things. It's that the programs produce bad results in other ways because they have bad incentives and disincentives, things like that. And it's also because the entire policymaking conversation is dominated by people like us, like the insufferable Washington people that you used to be, right? And in my case, the insufferable journalist. In that, we're mostly people who went to college, who have a certain degree of education, that kind of thing. As hard as it can be to negotiate the bureaucracies and deal with these programs, it's much easier for people like us than it is for a lot of other people. People who have less education, people who maybe don't have great literacy.
Yeah.
People who have other demands on them that come along with being just poor or having other sorts of problems. So in a way, it seems to me like there needs to be kind of two parts to the conversation. There's the part of the conversation that is these policies can work in certain kinds of ways, and there are some fairly obvious things or maybe less obvious to people outside of the world that should be pretty quickly and immediately reformed, things like the income caps and some of the asset things that are fixed at silly numbers and things like that. But the other thing I think is that our policymaking conversation should probably be more attuned to the fact of the sort of radical social differences between the groups of people that we're trying to serve. And, someone who is, functionally illiterate, whose income was $18,000 a year before becoming disabled or something like that, is probably going to require a higher and more expensive degree of service than someone who, was a $120,000 a year household or something like that before, and who are two married college graduates who can deal with the system a little bit better. But we seem in some ways disinclined to do that. In some ways, I think this goes back to the cultural point that you started with, that we've grown more used to dealing with disabilities of various kinds as the population gets older. So almost all of us will have, someone in the extended family who is using a wheelchair or who has, some other issue like that, but still less so among people who are both working age and working. And I think that's really where part of the focus needs to be in terms of thinking about this as a specific population that has different needs that will respond differently to different policies than people who are just 88 years old. I keep advancing the number here. It was 86, now it's 88. It's going to be 91 by the time we're done. And although I know some very healthy and active 90-year-olds.
Yeah.
So how do we go about, sorting that out? Because we are in a place where I would argue anyway that there's going to be some reform on the spending side of entitlements.
Yeah.
Although a lot of that's driven by Social Security, not by disability programs. Well, I mean, there's a Social Security disability program, obviously, but by the retirement programs themselves, and also Medicare, which tends to function largely as a subsidy for relatively well-off people. Although part of that's just driven by the fact that older people have more money than younger people. So how do we divide this up in such a way that we can attend to the fiscal stuff that needs to be attended to, attend to the incentive problems that need to be attended to, and then also deal with the fact that we're also going to have some people in this population who are not ever probably going to be work-bound and are going to require a much more intense level of support and subsidy than some other parts of the population.
Is
that an easy enough question for you?
Actually, this is what I think
Only
about.
took me 5 minutes to ask it.
This is what I think about all day, every day, Kevin, in my work. So I'm glad you brought it up. And I think the negotiations around this, and this is, me putting my Washington hat on, but around the One Big Beautiful bill, shone a spotlight on the debates we're going to have for the coming years, because of exactly what you kind of laid out there. And here's kind of my working thesis of the two things that need to be done. So the first thing is kind of looking at these different populations, as you kind of alluded to. And I think there's three big buckets when we think of, I'll keep saying, social safety net. And the first bucket are people who have an easier ramp to work. So maybe non-disabled people who are on food stamps and Medicaid and whatnot, and that really needs to be a very temporary situation, and we need to provide work support as quickly as we can, right? So that's the people who are, maybe fallen on bad times, or even young, able-bodied, have the ability to work, but have intergenerational poverty and don't know what a working household looks like. So that's one population.
I'm going to interrupt you real quick. What kind of work support works?
That's a good question. I think we're anybody who claims that they have that answer is about to be turned on their head with the AI revolution, right? There's going to be different kinds of jobs, and the jobs that we would have said work, are maybe won't work anymore. And so I think that is radically shifting. Across the other problem, we don't study that. We don't study what kind of work supports work in our public assistance for workforce programs. So you ask a state, I was working in the state of Georgia on this. We send the state of Georgia like $280 million in workforce dollars. And you say, what are their outcomes with those dollars? Nobody knows. We just don't study the outcomes of what works.
Yeah, I suspect that nobody knows on purpose. That's one of those things where no one asks the question because nobody wants to know the answer to it, because the answer is going to be the programs just generally aren't very effective.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so then there's a middle tier of people who need a higher degree of assistance, who can work but are going to need more support and more training and more of those wraparound services, and it's maybe a longer tail to get into the workforce. And then there is that population that maybe will not work, severe disability since childhood or whatnot. And how do we make the program work for those people? So they're not, right now, those people have to deal with such a complex system that makes their lives so hard. They have to battle with the state to redetermine to get their Medicaid services. And you say, I have a child who's had a severe disability since birth. Why do I have to prove that every single year through mounds of paperwork with the state? So we definitely have to fix that for those people and not make their lives harder than it already is. So those are kind of the buckets. And the other big piece is this systems reform. Right now, everything is a piecemeal program that has its different rules, its different case managers, its different asset and income limits, et cetera. And it makes this bureaucracy that becomes a job for people to navigate. And so, I say when I was in the hospital, I had a social worker visit me, said, you may not be able to work, so here are your options. Dropped 5 huge stacks of paperwork in front of me. I'm a quadriplegic. I can't hold a pencil. And when you get out, Rachel, you're going to have to go to this office in DC to get your transportation benefit. You're going to have to go to this, place if you want to do Social Security. If you want Medicaid, this is what you do. If you want childcare, all these different stacks of paperwork. Offices I have to go to. As somebody who can't yet drive, who can't hold a pencil, I have to figure out which offices, caseworkers I needed to talk to. Am I even eligible? I don't know what the eligibility levels are, and I'm even a public policy professional, And so this system has to change where we don't make people go through this.
Yeah. I often tell people that I'm basically an Eisenhower Republican at heart, but if I have to go get my driver's license renewed, I am ready to join a militia by the time I leave that office. And that's like, once every 10 years when you move or something. And of course, and I'm a perfectly healthy, reasonably able to deal with bureaucracy kind of guy. I can't imagine that, what life looks like when you are having to use a wheelchair or not even able to do that yet. I'm not able to get yourself into it. And basically every day is a trip to the DMV.
Yeah. Well, and you told me that you have triplets, young triplets. Imagine you're a single mom and you have to load your kids up and get to all these offices too.
Yeah.
So it's not just people with disabilities. I mean, you think about single moms who really need the help. It's incredibly hard on them. It's why do we make it so difficult? It's because up in D.C., everything was created in a different year, in a different committee, and we can't look at the system as a whole, and therefore the system doesn't look at a person as a whole.
Yeah. That actually brings up an interesting tension in the policymaking environment, which is, on the one hand, I have, and I think I speak for a pretty broad political tendency here, a strong preference for devolution of policy and for local solutions and subsidiarity and all that good stuff. The downside of that, of course, is that you get lots of inconsistency. So if every county has a different way of doing things, every state has a different way of doing things, then that makes it sort of more difficult for people. On the other end, you can get a very standard federal system, which has its own problems because it's standardized and doesn't take into account various sorts of particularities that need to be accounted for. And that's one thing if you're, say, Sweden, where they have this very strong government footprint in healthcare, but it's actually largely administered at the municipal level, not at the federal level. But they also have 6 people live there. It's a small country and everybody knows each other. And so it's maybe a little bit easier to do than it is in a country where, you look at the D.C. Metro is, a population of a smallish European country, but it's a lot of people, a lot of genuine diversity in the United States. When people use the word diversity, they're normally talking about race and sexuality and things like that. But it's actually we're just a very, very complicated society in all sorts of ways. Socioeconomic ways, cultural ways, other sorts of things. So how do we accommodate that from a policy point of view? Am I wrong in my preference for localism? Are we doomed to deal with a one-size-fits-all federal system, or what? We were just saying nice things about the ADA a while ago. Now I'm depressed.
I know. When you think about it too much, it is depressing to think about how could this ever change. It's a both. So Medicaid is a very state-driven program. States have very different rules. And so you talk to families with children with disabilities, and they'll say, if you're looking to get a personal care attendant through Medicaid, like I talked about earlier, you live in one state. I talked to a mom who I don't know how long she waited, 6-7 years. And this is a mama bear, talks to politicians, I'm going to get my child help. Took her years to get her son off of the wait list for one of these caregivers in Medicaid in Pennsylvania. But then her husband got a better job opportunity, or something happened where they had to move to Florida. They had waited all these years in Pennsylvania. Now they had to get back on the wait list in Florida because it's a state-administered system. Wait list in Florida has 20,000 people on it. People wait 10 years in Florida to get a personal care assistant. So what ends up happening is these families with kids with disabilities or other family members, they can't ever move. Once they get off the wait list, they are stuck in that state. So they can't move for a better job opportunity or living situation, whatever it is. So that's an example, I think, of where, gosh, it would make sense to have at least something that's portable among states. And so I think I tend to think that if we let states innovate, things would be better. The problem with most of these programs is that it's federal dollars going to the states with lots of federal parameters and rules around them. So if a state wants to try something innovative, I think solving poverty and work, how do we get people into work when they don't have a culture of work? These are really hard questions that I don't think a one-size-fits-all approach. And if you have somebody experimenting in West Virginia versus Idaho, you're going to come up with radically different answers. But the federal programs are so inflexible that states can't really do that.
We don't really do politics here, but there's a very prominent man about town here in Washington who once said, "No one knew healthcare could be so complicated." Yeah, I think everyone knew.
Everyone knew.
I mean,
Yeah.
like, even those of us who don't make that the focus of our lives, everyone kind of knew. Step back from the policy stuff for a second. Where'd you grow up and go to school and all that stuff?
I grew up in Ocala, Florida. You can't say it faster. It sounds like California, but Ocala, Florida. And I went to the University of Florida.
What'd you study?
I knew I always wanted to be a Washington person. That insufferable. I studied political science.
Right. Did you work summers and stuff when you were a kid? Did you have?
Yeah. So I worked volleyball camp. So I was a big volleyball player. So I worked volleyball camps for younger girls. I babysat all the time, which now that I'm a mom, I realize kids don't do anymore. 12-year-olds don't babysit anymore.
Well, I can talk to you about babysitting all day. And actually, you mentioned earlier that AI is going to disrupt the economy, and as soon as it puts all the paralegals out of work, they're going to have plenty of home health aides and babysitters and stuff. Those will be the only in-person jobs. Will be the only thing left.
I thought about that the caregiving shortage might be solved by this.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to make a lot of people happy, except people in the market for those services. But that's neither here nor there. So you grew up in Florida. You went to the University of Florida. You did volleyball camps. What do you do at volleyball camps? You're teaching kids how to play better volleyball, or you're just sort of a camp counselor? Or?
Yeah, teaching little girls how to play volleyball, which was my passion growing up. And then let's see, I had a summer as a beer cart girl. So
A beer cart girl
at a golf course. Yep.
So there's a golf course that has a girl who just goes around with a beer cart and people can buy beer on the course.
Are you not a golfer?
I'm not a golfer.
Okay.
I know how this works. So
yeah, I think most golf courses have this.
I've played, I think, 3 rounds of golf in my life.
Okay.
Something like that.
Yeah. I was not yet of age to drink, but I could somehow serve alcohol out of a golf cart. And yeah, that was one of my first W-2 jobs.
And did those beers disappear from time to time and make it into your?
I was very good at Diet Coke. Was it?
Yeah.
It was very hot in Florida doing this, right? All summer long.
No, I worked at Texas Tech football games when I was a kid.
Okay.
And I actually worked for the Coca-Cola bottling company back then, whose subsidiary sold the concessions there at the games. But there were also people selling beer at the games, and those were not strictly sold. I think with a great deal of enforcement.
The
on
inventory
age
wasn't
limit.
taken. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there might have been some diversion. You might call it embezzling if it were cash, but,
or a bonus, overtime bonus. I don't know.
one thing or the other. Yeah, something like that. And then you went straight from college to Washington then?
Yeah, I had done a bunch of internships in college. So I think this kind of on the job training.
Mm-hmm.
This is obviously a very white collar version of on the job training, but I think that, gosh, it's so important for people to get was more important than my degree. So I had I worked in a marketing shop for a company that was local to Gainesville, Florida, and I also worked at the local sheriff's office in Ocala, Florida, in the public information office, where I got to look through the crime report of the previous day and give it to journalists.
So you learned how to lie to reporters early. It's made you it's a very valuable Washington
I know your
skill.
type,
Yes.
yeah. So yeah, that was a blast. I did that my sophomore year of college. And I had done an internship up here and just fell in love with it. And I came back to the little company in Gainesville, Florida I worked for, and I was so mad about the overregulation that they face. I was like, they can't get their product to market because of these regulations, but they're getting their product to market in Europe because they don't have them. And yeah, I think my place is probably DC.
The sheriff's office thing just reminds me that being from Texas, the only elected office I would ever like to have would be a county sheriff somewhere in Texas. I think that'd just be a great job. I'm sure it's not. I'm sure it's terrible because you're essentially a county administrator, and it's not nearly as much fun as it sounds like being a sheriff in Texas. But
I don't know. They seem to have a lot of fun.
There's part of me that still kind of speaks to you. Don't worry, I'm not running for office in case anyone's out there starting the Oppo research, which would be terrible. Did you learn much from those jobs that was useful to you later in life?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think even just basic executive function. So I was recently in a conversation about, I'm thinking about my kids with AI in the future and what kind of jobs will they have and how does their education prepare them for the future? As you do, that's what you think about in the middle of the night when you're a mom. And this conversation I had about a future of work situation was about just basic skills of creativity and executive function and time management and managing up and all of these things and dealing with different personalities in like a social setting and whatnot, and how these skills, no matter what the future looks like, are so important in a workplace. And I think that's probably the biggest thing that I took away was how to work.
Yeah, last episode we had Adam Bello on, who's book editor and a book publisher, and I asked him about this, and I'll ask you about it too. But the role of internships, particularly in Washington or in kind of New York publishing and journalism, I think is an interesting thing in that they're useful. People learn from them. They do create opportunities for people and stuff, but they also, I think, sometimes function as a kind of economic filter. There are only certain people who can afford to have these either unpaid or very, very low paid internships. And, you're not going to live in New York City for 2 years learning to be a book publisher or a book editor.
Right.
On an income of $6,000 or whatever they do with that. What do you think about the sort of internship culture here in Washington?
The sorting that it kind of creates naturally. Yeah, having worked in a couple of different congressional offices, I think there are things that I think members of Congress, it's actually incumbent upon them to recruit broader. And I think if you're a member of Congress that states certain political values, you especially should be hiring interns that meet those values that you are trying to solve in public policy. And so one member of Congress I work for, she had people with disabilities as interns, like a Down syndrome person with Down syndrome as an intern. And she even once hired somebody who worked on the cleaning staff in the Capitol and had talked to her every day. And this woman, she was like, why don't you come have an internship in my office instead of working the cleaning staff here? And I think that kind of thing is needed the member of Congress is essentially the CEO of their office.
Yeah.
And so they have the choice of what kind of hiring that they do. And so I think that they can change that culture if they want to.
Yeah. Back to the policy conversation. You have sort of a top 5 list of things you'd like to see changed and implemented?
Yeah, I think one, this systems reform that I talked about. And so we have a policy that I've been kind of working on in states called One Door to Work, that when you go in looking for help, let's say you're looking for food assistance or you're looking for Medicaid, when you go into that one door, that caseworker has the tools to help you navigate the whole social safety net and navigate the whole public workforce training system, and help you create your path to whatever independence looks like in your situation. So I think this kind of integration of programs is like my number one across the safety net for people with and without disabilities. And then especially for people with disabilities, it's way too complicated. So this kind of one door simplification. Next, these asset and income limits have got to change. I mean, they are such huge barriers for people getting to work and getting married. People with disabilities don't get married because they'll lose their personal care attendant. So we've got to fix the asset and income limits across Medicaid and Social Security disability. Those are 2 huge items. And then I think just a lot more flexibility to innovate. So, why don't we experiment with giving people with disabilities their Medicaid dollars in a 529 account instead of going through a managed care system that siphons off half the money for administrative burden and then dictates what kind of care you can or can't hire.
So for people who don't know, a 529 account.
Oh, yeah. It's just a savings account. So there are these savings accounts for people with disabilities called ABLE accounts. So if you open up a savings account for your child's education, that's a 529 account. There's these different accounts called ABLE accounts that you can also open up if you're a person with a disability.
Gotcha. Yeah, one of my my little go-to policy things is the easiest thing to do for poor people, I think, is to give them money. And that often seems to solve a lot of their problems.
Yeah.
Rather than trying to re-engineer the economy or the workforce or employer regulations for benefits and things like that, and use, the employer as a sort of substitute welfare state, which is what we do. And the only reason we do that, the main reason we do that is because it keeps it off the budget, right? So if we want to provide X, Y, and Z benefits to low-income workers, we can just pass a rule that says their employers have to do it, and pretend like we haven't spent money because it doesn't show up, on the cash flow statements.
It's like let people decide and let people have dignity is a value.
Yeah, and also that the markets work. So I have I tell this story a lot. When I was living in New York, I had a doctor I used to go to. This is my kind of general guy, and I had sort of an ongoing issue that I was getting some help with. He's one of these doctors who he had two people in his office. It was him and another doctor. They had no secretary, nothing like that. They would not look at an insurance card. It was if your insurance card says American Express on it, they're fine, and it's the only card they would look at. But it was great in some ways in that you could call and get an answer or, make an appointment. And it was pretty flexible. It was expensive, of course, as you might imagine. And I remember seeing a picture of him. He had a picture on the wall of him standing in front of one of the Ferraris. And I said, I think I'm paying you too much. And he said, do you really want a doctor who can't afford a Ferrari? And I'd say that's a good point. But so markets do work in that kind of that kind of system. I think a lot of us have experience now is with various kinds of providers that you pay out of pocket for various sorts of things. I think it's a much more common thing now than it was 20 years ago. But I'm a newborn with a profound mental disability, and I'm probably never going to be able to work. Markets don't work there super well. So I wonder, if you thought much, I don't know you have, about what the limits are in terms of, market-oriented reform, of, giving people dignity and choices and things like that. Then also being frank about recognizing situations in which we can't really give people choices because they're not able to make the choices.
Right. And in that case, you're thinking about the family having choice and agency about what's best for their child. And then even as they grow older and they're an adult child with a disability and their parents are making decisions for them, in most cases, the parents are going to know what's best and want what's best, and giving them the tools they can. And we do need a working safety net. And as I said before, those families right now, they go through this managed care system. They have to prove to their state that they're disabled every single year and do tons of paperwork. And then it falls apart and they don't have a caregiver. And it's hard enough to find. There's such a extreme caregiver shortage in every state that it's hard to find the workforce to provide care. It's a tough job.
Yeah.
And so I think as much when we say like markets work, sure, we're providing a government subsidy, but with that government subsidy, does the family unit have agency over who they hire and how long they hire them for, and et cetera? Is there right now there's restrictions of you have to have somebody with certain levels of training, and maybe you need that intense medical care for 5 hours a day, but you don't need it the other 5 hours a day. So more agency when we say like let the market work. It's almost like I think of it like an ed savings account, right? That still can go to, the charter school or public school or whatnot, or the private school if they so choose. So giving people choices about what's best for their family.
Yeah. I think, and again, the policymaking conversation tends to be dominated by a relatively narrow group of people, as I alluded to earlier. And a lot of middle class to upper middle class professional people actually do have experience with Medicaid, but their sole experience with Medicaid is how quickly can we get grandma's assets off the books so we can put her in the nursing home and have Medicaid pay for it.
Yeah.
And which I think makes the program feel and look like a scam to a lot of people, or an easily abused program. So that's kind of one cultural pole. At the other end, maybe I'm free associating a little bit too much here, but I think that there's been a real success story culturally and with economic consequences when it comes to the case of people with Down syndrome, where in the last 30 years or so, 25 years or so, we've just gotten a lot more used to the idea of having them in just ordinary social situations, that they can work,
Yeah.
That there's, of course, there's a range of severity with that particular disability, and some folks can work perfectly well, some folks can't, and maybe that's created some room for us to have a broader and more productive conversation about there are things we can do to make people who have disabilities have lives that look more like that, and less that looks like what we're used to with seeing Medicaid scams.
Yeah.
Or at least abuse of the system,
Right. And these aren't easy answers, or else I think somebody would have solved it, right? Because it's all deeply individual. It's kind of what we're getting at through all of this is each person is not going to have the same needs. Each person in a wheelchair isn't going to have the same needs. Each person with Down syndrome isn't going to have the same needs. And so that's kind of why I get to more flexibility and agency in how we deliver the services. And so, for people with disabilities, the workforce program is called vocational rehab. I had to get my car outfit. I could have gotten vocational rehab grant dollars to get my car outfitted to drive to work. But that would have, I think it was like an 8-month waiting list and like 3 interviews I had to do. And I was like, I don't want to wait 8 months to get back to work. I want to get back to work now.
What are we, Canadians?
Yeah. It's like, what am I going to do for 8 months waiting around, And so, why couldn't they just put the grant money in if I open an ABLE account, right? And I could have gone and gotten my car outfitted myself instead of jumping through all these hoops. And I get it. We're guarding against fraud, right? Yeah. We're very worried about guarding against fraud all of the time. But if that's our highest good, especially in kind of center-right circles, is we're always thinking about fraud first, then what are the downstream effects for the people who really need it? And that really needs to be balanced.
Yeah. And if we really were serious about that, it seems like there'd be less fraud
in
the system. I mean, we do talk about it a lot, and we do make a lot of policies that way, but it's still a persistent problem, particularly with Medicaid and to a lesser extent with Medicare. But you probably know this stuff at least as well as I do, if not a lot better. But yeah, fraud prevention is a good, but not the controlling good, I think.
What's your top, if you were like to wave a magic wand, your top policy change for safety net reform?
In the broader safety net, I would just simply take high-income people off Social Security. At a pretty high level. There's no reason to be writing Bill Gates a check every month. When everyone knows this story, I think everyone in the policy world knows this story, but when FDR was cooking up this program, he very specifically didn't want to have any means testing of Social Security, just purely for political reasons. Because once you get people convinced that it's some sort of investment that you've quote unquote paid into, and here come the emails, I can feel them already, but it's phony. There's no investment, there's no trust fund, you don't pay anything into it, it's just a tax and a benefit.
Yeah.
But he knew that once you structured it that way and gave wealthy people and upper middle class people some skin in the game in terms of the benefits, then it would be an unreformable program. And he wanted it to be an unreformable program. I think his quote was, that means in 20 years, no damn politician can mess with my Social Security program or can muck up my Social Security program, whatever he said. He was right. I think that on the policy front, as I mentioned earlier, we should probably just make a pretty strong distinction between we're giving resources to people who are poor because they're poor and they just don't have enough income to deal with these particular situations, and be pretty frank about that, and have a whole different set of assumptions and policies for these are problems we're also dealing with in some ways, but they're not primarily driven by poverty. They're driven by special situations like disabilities. They're driven by other sorts of things. Economic tools are good for economic problems. They're not good for every problem. That's why we don't say markets will work when it comes to national security or lots of other things like that.
Yeah.
Or to children with disabilities. Go to work, little 3-year-old. Although I'll tell my little 3-year-old to go to work sometimes. But my main thing is I don't like our cultural attitudes toward work. I think that we have this really poisonous, toxic. And man, I hate using toxic in that way. It's such a cliche, but it came out of my mouth, so I'm not going to go back and edit it. We have this tendency to really valorize certain kinds of jobs and to hold other jobs in contempt. And it doesn't, strictly speaking, have to do with money. because there are a lot of, it's a cliche again, but there are a lot of plumbers out there who make a whole lot of money.
Yeah.
A whole lot more money than your median, DC journalist you see on television
Yes.
sometimes, or your median DC policy wonk you see on television sometimes. There's a lot of prestige associated with those jobs, but not necessarily a lot of money. And but we treat people who are in jobs that don't require college education or a special license or something like that as being somehow, losers. They could have made something more of their lives if they had done something else. And that's just, nonsense. Of course, there are people who do all sorts of interesting and productive and rewarding work and often highly paid work that doesn't come from that pretty narrow, post-war 1950s, 1960s view of what success looks like. High school, college, 4-year degree, job, maybe an advanced degree of some kind, or
Wearing a
professional
nice suit
license.
like Kevin.
No one wears this suit to work. This is not a suit you wear to get a job in. This is a suit you wear when you don't have to wear a suit. You just like to wear suits. But I've often used the example of Jesse James from West Coast Choppers. This guy's basically a welder, right? And but he got interested in customizing motorcycles and things like that. Made this huge successful career out of it. I interviewed him one time, and he was on his way to his summer home in like Martha's Vineyard or wherever it was. And so these guys who make $80,000 a year playing with spreadsheets go home and they watch television shows about guys who weld and build motorcycles and customize cars and things like that, who make 6 times as much money as they do, or 60 times as much money as they do in some cases. But we still have this culture that goes on that sort of holds those jobs in contempt.
Yeah.
He's just a welder, or he's just a guy who works in a mechanic shop, or he's an auto body business or something like that. And I think that challenging and changing those attitudes would do a great deal of work, I think, for not only the median worker, and the median blue-collar worker, but I also think, to bring it back to our earlier conversation, people with disabilities, that I suppose the grocery store business might be the most common place you see this, where at least it was when I was growing up, and it still seems to be, where you'll meet a lot of people who have mental disabilities working in grocery stores, doing bagging, stocking, things like that. And I think that if we took a healthier and at the risk of broaching the subject of religion, a more spiritually enlightened view of work, that work provides non-material benefits both to the worker and to the person being served. It changes the nature of society. It changes the whole kind of social relationship. That we could do a better job with those positions, both in terms of how they work economically, but also how they work socially. And a lot of people who could work in certain kinds of jobs don't work in those jobs, and they remain dependents on public programs and things like that. Not because the job wouldn't make them materially better off, but because of the status issues associated with it. I don't want to go work at McDonald's.
Yeah.
I don't want to go be a home health aide. I don't want to do this, that, or the other. But I think if we had healthier social attitudes toward those things that would get more people into the workforce, which would make their lives better, but also make everyone else's lives better. I mean, my kind of go-to Hayekian point on all this stuff is that the genius who invents the next big thing that makes all of our lives radically better, the guy who discovers the cure for cancer, he's going to make $1 billion off of it, and I'm great, and I hope he does. But he couldn't do it if he had to grow his own potatoes, if he had to sold his own shoes. And so, a modern economy really is something we all do together. It is a group project in many ways. The rewards obviously aren't evenly distributed, and there's good reason for that. But I think if we understood it, then we probably wouldn't look at those grocery store jobs as, well, that's good enough for someone who's got, a mental disability.
Yeah.
Or for someone who's 16 or something like that. We would just think of it as being good, period.
I think this is where probably the disability community has so much to add to the work conversation, because the disability community, across different types of disabilities, are just knocking at the door saying, we want to work because we know the social benefits and just let us in the door. So recently talked to this mom, daughter, Down syndrome. I think she had gone through a kind of there are a couple upstart college programs that help people with developmental disabilities acclimate to campus life and everything. And I think she had gone through one of those, came out, kept interviewing, wanted to work so badly, and no one would hire her. So her mom was like, you're going to start your own business. Now she has a 7-figure business and hires probably, I think she said, like 15 other people who are either formerly incarcerated, have disabilities have trouble getting hired elsewhere
Hmm.
and has a 7-figure business now.
Hmm.
And it just
Her own podcast.
yeah,
Good guess.
she probably would. She's
I'll ask you about that later.
but I talked to another friend who after she had rehabbed from her accident was like, I don't want to live in subsistence on SSDI for the rest of my life. So I'm going to do everything I can to get into work. And so she trained for a different line of work. And she showed up even when you have a spinal cord injury, you can't really control your bowel and bladder all the time. So she would have accidents on the job, get herself to the bathroom and change herself in the middle of the day. Like, think about how hard that is. But she wanted to work so badly that she was going to persevere through that. And I think this culture of like people with disabilities know that work means creating a community, creating a life, feeling value that you created something with your talents at the end of the day, and that the world recognized that by paying you. It's just something that I think the rest of culture could benefit so much from seeing in our labor force.
Yeah. And as we get ready to close out the conversation here, I'm going to plug your organization, say what you are, what you do, and what you need.
Yeah. So I'm the director of Able Americans, and that is a think tank project. You can go to ableamericans.us, and we have all of our policy papers. So our goal is to create policy change and to educate people about all these barriers, because I think really there isn't change because people don't know how bad the system is. People don't know that these things, these barriers exist. So we're going to write policy papers about it. We're going to tell stories about it, video stories of people's lives, and we are going to, highlight things happening in the news. But the goal is to create federal and state policy change.
Are you a donor-supported organization?
We are. Yep, we are 501c3, and we welcome generous donors.
When that's the case, I just like to let people know that so that it's out there for people who are listening. Hey, I enjoyed the conversation very much, and I hope we can do this again sometime.
Thank you, Kevin. I loved being on.